Hello, everyone. Hello, good evening. Welcome to the Center for Brooklyn History. We are absolutely thrilled to be hosting tonight's conversation with Heather Ann Thompson and Chenjerai Kumanyika about Thompson's new book, Fear and Fury, Bernie Goetz, the Reagan 80s, and the Rebirth of White Rage. My name is Marcia Eli. On behalf of all of my colleagues here at the Center for Brooklyn History and at the Brooklyn Public Library, which we are now a part of, and the Arts and Culture team BPL Presents, I get to say a few words of hello. I remember, as I'm sure many of you do, living here in New York City in 1984, and the infamous subway shooting that shook every neighborhood in every borough. It dominated the news, became an ongoing topic of conversation between friends, and led to inescapable self-reflection for so many New Yorkers, providing a mirror to our city's bigotry, violence, safety, and racial tensions. In Fear and Fury, Thompson turns her formidable talents towards the meaning of that pivotal moment and connects those dots across 4 decades to how we are today. I can think of few people as perfectly suited to lead this conversation with Heather Ann than Chenjerai Kumanyika, who is a master of audio journalism and insightful critique of America's historical myths about race. I want to share that following their conversation, we'll take questions from you. Our ushers will bring mics to you in your seats. Please just help us out by standing so we can see you, mostly so they can see you, and keep your questions brief. I hope that as you came in, you saw that Fear and Fury is on sale at the CBH shop over there in that corner. Heather Ann will sign copies later at a table in the front. So now let me tell you just a little bit more about our guests, and then I'll invite them to the stage. Heather Ann Thompson is a historian and the Pulitzer Prize and Bancroft Prize winning author of Blood in the Water, the Attica Prison Uprising of 1971 and Its Legacy. She is also the author of Who's Detroit? Politics, Labor, and Race in a Modern American City, and writes regularly on the criminal justice system. Her policy work includes serving on a National Academy of Science Blue Ribbon panel that studied the causes and consequences of mass incarceration in the U.S. She also co-runs the Carceral State Research Project at the University of Michigan. Chenjerai Kumanyika is assistant professor of journalism at New York University and the co-creator, co-executive producer, and co-host of Uncivil, Jim Litt's Media's podcast on the Civil War. He is also host of the podcast Empire City and Unruly Subjects, and collaborator/co-host for Scene on Radio's influential Season 2, titled Seeing White, and Season 4 on the history of American democracy. He has written widely in both scholarly and public venues. He serves on the board of The Moth, and his work has been recognized with numerous honors, including the George Foster Peabody Award for Uncivil. We are so excited that you are both here in the building, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say. I know we all feel that way. Please help me welcome Heather Ann Thompson and Kevin Sidney-Haka.
What's going on, y'all? How you feeling? 2 quick things I want to say before we get into it. One is that it's really meaningful to be here at the Center for Brooklyn History. On Heather's advice, I don't know if y'all know, but Heather was the historical consultant for Empire City. So most things that are good about that show happened because she steered me away from terrible historical directions into good things, and one of them was into these archives where I learned a lot about my dad, so I have a deeply personal connection. I just wanted to say, so thank you for that work, and it shows why we have to keep these institutions alive. The second thing I want to say is that I want to thank you all for coming here and showing up. I know there are other places you could be, and I know a lot of people say that in general. But in the context of this book, which really revisits and slows things down, I think that showing up and attending to this history in a slow way is an important kind of ontological resistance, because the pace of what's happening to us so fast sort of forces us to almost want to just accept the frames where everything is binary. We want to flatten characters. We don't want to accept events without context, right? And it takes a kind of commitment to say, you know what, I refuse to understand the world this way. I want context, and I want to understand it. And that's what this book does so well, but it takes you to do that, so thank you. Y'all, this book, I don't know how many of you, if any of y'all have gotten a chance to read it, oh my God. You're just gonna have to deal with me being an evangelist for the book. That's part of my job. This was something that I lived through as a young person and thought I understood. And when I tell you, it is one of the most riveting. I mean, this is like reading this book. I said it's been terrible for my marriage, because I'm sitting at home with my wife, like I really want to hear what you're saying, but unfortunately, I have to finish this chapter about a story which I already know the ending to. Anyway, so jumping into that, the first thing I want to say, so Heather, when you started this book, you were actually working on another project on the history of MOVE, right? Which I'm very excited about. I know we're all like, oh man, we definitely want that. What made you pause that project and say, this particular story about the legacy of Bernie Goetz is it's crucial to tell right now?
Well, first of all, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Chandra, for being here with me. I think the answer is pretty simple and straightforward. Like I'm sure everybody in this room, was just, I think, traumatized, gobsmacked, at a loss, watching the nation just careen in the direction that it is currently in. And so starting really right after I finished the Attico book in 2016, just the kind of unthinkable that, Trump becomes president, and then so many unthinkable things that had already happened even before that, so much police violence, so many acts of vigilante violence that were just getting worse and worse, and truth was mattering less and less. And the democracy was feeling more and more precarious. And the historian in me just said, I just need to stop a minute, put MOVE not away, it's still there, I'm still working on it, it will still come, but to just take a pause and say, we need to understand this right now moment, because it could not possibly have just come from Trump. It could not possibly, we can't explain this as Trumpism, as tempting as it would be to just say, if we can just get to the midterm elections, this is all going to change. And the historian in me is like, there's just no way in the world. So what is the lineage of this? And of course, the long answer is, this is America, right? The way in which racial violence is, baked into the DNA of this country. That's the long history. But what is the more immediate history that suddenly we take a turn in this country, that the rule of law really doesn't matter anymore, truth doesn't matter anymore? And I remembered another moment that just started to feel like it was happening, which was the 80s. And an event that felt really, really similar to Kyle Rittenhouse going in and shooting people down with impunity, or people holding, George Floyd in a chokehold with impunity. I mean, it just felt like, okay, is that when? And then I was off to the races just to try to understand the 80s.
Wow. I mean, I just got to say, I think that's brilliant, because a lot of people were like, as we've tried to grapple with this moment, people are going to like Franco and Mussolini and all, I'm trying to open up Hannah Arendt and struggle through. It's like, and you went right to this moment, which does really turn out to explain a hell of a lot. So let's walk into that moment just to bring us all on the same page. Could you just walk us through a little bit about what actually occurred at this event.
And I will just quickly say, one thing I forgot to say to your previous question was I grew up in the city of Detroit, and as a Detroiter in the inner city, I remember the 80s as feeling like things were changing fundamentally. So that's why the 80s also just kind of felt like, I remember when Reagan was elected, and I remember in my high school, just this kind of sense of just kind of despair descending over the room, like something fundamentally is changing. So anyway, that's back to your previous question. What happened? I mean, I think several of us are of a generation that we remember it, but I'm suspecting there's also some people in the room that might not know this story. In a nutshell, the story is that in New York City on December 22nd, 1984, 3 days before Christmas, 4 black teenagers who lived in the South Bronx decided to get on that train, go down into the city to a local video arcade was their plan, to jimmy open some coin receptacles to get some quarters out, in no small part because their own economic circumstance was so precarious and had been frayed so much already by 1984 as a result of Reaganomics. And on this same train gets a lone white guy named Bernie Goetz. And within 5 minutes of a very, very brief encounter between he and only one of the boys, named Troy Canty, who simply says first, "Hey, how you doing?" And then when he gets a greeting back, then says, "Hey, you got $5? Which, again, any of us remember the 80s, panhandling was the way of it, right? You walk down the street, you got $5, you got $2, the squeegee guys who come out and do your windshield.
Even now, people ask for it.
Exactly. This is city life. And he stands up. They think he's going to give him $5 because he turns and he sort of looks as if he's reaching in his wallet. But what he's doing is he's reaching into a hidden holster, and he swings back around, assumes a combat stance, shoots Troy Canty straight in the chest, then shoots his friend Barry Allen, who's standing behind him, but had never even spoken to Bernie Goetz, shoots him in the back as he's trying to run away. Mind you, you've all been in a subway car. You know how tight this space is. And then shoots their friend James Ramseur, who's a little farther down, who is panicking. He's trying to get out of the car, shoots him in the arm. It goes through his side into his lungs. And then he shoots this 4th kid, Darrell Cabey, who's the farthest away from him, and he misses. And what is kind of chilling and startling is that he then walks over to Darrell Cabey, who's by this point cowering on his chair, on the seat, and he keeps just saying, "I didn't do nothing, man, I didn't do nothing." And he puts the gun to his side and he shoots him at point blank range, severing his spinal cord right in that moment and paralyzing him for life. And then that story, as horrific as it is really just the prelude of the story, because he then disappears into the subway tunnel. He's on the lam. Nobody knows even who he is, while these 4 teenagers are brought to local hospitals and straight into ICUs. And overnight, he becomes the hero. He becomes the death wish vigilante, the guy that did what everybody, meaning white New Yorkers mostly, wish they could have had the guts to do. And these victims become the villains. And therein lie at least the kernel of the story that I thought, what's going on here? Because at least in that moment, it wasn't clear what was going to happen to him. And so the story of what happens to Bernie Goetz, it turns out, is an extraordinarily important blueprint, both legally and culturally, for what's going to happen next, in no small part because all the same characters that you know and love, Giuliani, Rupert Murdoch, Donald Trump, they are all on the scene of this story and learn a great deal from it about how to do politics, what works, and essentially the power of stoking white resentment and rage.
Folks, when I tell you it's visceral, it's a very engaging read. You will be glad you read it, but it will not be it's not an easy read, right? Because of what we learned. But I gotta say, I mean, one of the reasons why I'm in the business I'm in is because I get to learn from and hang out with people who I feel are almost like sorcerers in their ability to understand events. And I want to get to a question about narrative, but I just got to say, Heather, like, in order to render this story, first of all, let me just say something, y'all. I'm a scholar, right? And I want to say this in the most compassionate way I can about scholarly writing.
Oh boy.
Let me start by saying I'm a fan of scholarly writing. My shelves are filled. I'm a deep consumer of the most dense kind of scholarly writing that people sometimes hate on. But the prose in this book is gorgeous. It is just beautiful. It's an easy read. I couldn't put it down. I literally couldn't put it down, really. And one of the features of it is, in order to tell this story, not only did you have to put yourself in that subway, in that moment, just bracketing out for a moment the context that we get, which is a lot, but then we're going to get to the trial. And you had to understand deeply, like, in the heads of the jurors, of the prosecution, of the defense, of the judge, of the people, sadly, of the New York Post, and like, yeah, I want to ask a little bit, like, I hate to talk shop, but how did you make sense of all those different vantage points?
Yeah, it's funny because usually I think the way that historians are, the way we're trained is to always think the big picture, like what are the big levers being pulled? What does this all add up to? And I kept thinking about that in the back of my mind, but before I could even get there, I just had to understand what happened, like literally what happened, like, the timeline and what was the evidence presented when, and why did the jury make the decision that they did, which was to acquit him. Spoiler alert, but it's an unimportant spoiler alert because you know that, right? Intuitively, you know that from where history goes. And it was unfathomable at some guttural level that could have happened. So it really required walking through the day by day. Like, it's one thing to just say, these boys get villainized, but I wanted to know how, right? Like, how did they get villainized? How was it that 4 teenagers who are fighting for their life in a hospital, who have literally no weapons on them, who have had, one of them has a, hello, give me $5, do you have $5? How does that become Bernie Goetz is the hero? And of course, the details matter. For example, it turned out, to my surprise, that these teenagers had amassed collectively a whole host of misdemeanor citations growing up in the Daniel Webster homes in the South Bronx. But what does that mean? You got to understand what that means. That means things like jumping subway turnstiles because you don't have money to ride the subway, or jimmying open laundromat coin receptacles because you need some quarters, or trespassing, which means hanging outside of the community center after it's closed, things like this, right? And what happens is they're in the hospital, and the cops basically, first order of business is, well, what have they done? Right? What have they done? Because surely they must have done something to warrant this. So they start digging, they find these misdemeanor citations, and then 2 Bronx judges just decide to take all of these citations and turn them into warrants for their arrest while they're still in the hospital. And so what do you suppose the headlines are? 13 outstanding arrests for these teenagers, and they're described by the judge as violent thugs. And again, why were they outstanding citations? Because if you had a citation for jumping a subway turnstile and you went to court, what would happen? You'd get a fine. And any smart teenager knew that they didn't have $250 for that fine or whatever, so they just ignored the citations. So it was the creation of this narrative that I was really interested in.
I mean, and just to slow that down, I mean, I just want us to appreciate. Now, I want to get this right. The judge, it's one thing when you have a sort of active, this kind of vigilante, shooting, and then people report on warrants. Yeah. But you're saying these warrants were issued, right?
Yes.
They were issued after the shooting.
Yes. And that was the other surprising piece of this story. Not surprising in a, like, are you kidding me? But just surprising at the complexity of the way in which this moment we're in now was crafted, curated, stoked, facilitated by all kinds of actors that you might not suspect. The other story like that one, there's the judges that issue the warrants, but there's also one of the most injured is Darrell Cabey. He's the one that's paralyzed, and his mother, who is really the heroine of this story, she refuses to keep having her son be maligned like this. I mean, they're threatened. The hate mail that I had to pour through was just, you have to just kind of take a shower afterwards. It was just so brutal. But she refuses to put up with this. So one of this incredible research moment, she decides she's going to apply for funding from the New York State Crime Victims Board, which this is like, what is that, right? This is a fun setup. If you are brutalized by a crime, you have a right in New York to get some compensation, particularly if you can't work or you're somehow, injured beyond your ability to take care of yourself. So she's had to quit her good state job to take care of her son. He can never work again, so she applies for this money, and she's denied. Not once, but twice. And then she sues, and then she's denied again. But if you dig into this paperwork of how she is denied, which I tell this story, it is just the acrobatics that those petty bureaucrats basically had to go through to decide that Darrell Cabey was the criminal, not the victim. So these are these research moments that it was the slowing down and the telling of the story that mattered.
Oh man, you chose to tell us a story about the 80s, and in so doing, because one of the things that I think is also really interesting about this book is that it's a very beat by beat, narratively driven story that lets us know, retells the story we thought we knew. But it also is a story about structures and about larger forces that are shaping everyone, including Goetz, right? And again, one thing I appreciate about this is that in trying to grapple with what happened in the 80s, there are a lot of people who, we have scholarly terms. Speaking of scholar, right? We have like neoliberalism. We have like these big ugly terms that start getting tossed around all the time, and it's not totally clear what they mean. They're probably overused. And you are actually giving us the sort of material, like, here's what happened. Here's the, So essentially, why did you say, you said, when you initially talked about it, it was interesting to hear you say you thought about the feeling you had about things changing, things are different, and the 80s kind of pointed you that way. But in terms of an intervention about sort of political theory and what, for example, the Reagan 80s has to do with this moment now we're in, in other words, some people might just say, what does neoliberalism have to do with fascism? What did this story teach you about those things?
I love that question, because that's the part of the book that I prayed didn't slow down the narrative or slow down readers, because the first half I'm constantly shifting between the story of these kids and Bernie Goetz and the event, and I'm taking you into this political moment, which is the Reagan 80s. And I struggled with that. It's like, do we want to break up the story? Do we want to go to the Reagan 80s? And I realized that we had to. And the reason we had to was because, in fact, something really different was afoot in the 80s. And we sort of knew it at the time, but I think collectively as a nation, we have forgotten just exactly how big of a rupture the 80s was. And just, if you'll indulge me just quickly, I think that the rupture really matters, because shorthand, you have the 19th century, following the abolition of enslavement, and, it's a free-for-all. The rule of law doesn't matter. There is no social safety net. It's the Gilded Age. It's the Jim Crow era, right? Lynchings are everywhere, culturally sanctioned, legally okay. And there's no safety net for ordinary people because rich people could do whatever they wanted to do. They had to pay no taxes. There was no regulations on them. But then something happens. It was called the Great Depression. And the Great Depression rips the rug out of, not just the poorest of the poor, but really the nation as a whole. And into that vacuum comes a demand for some sort of social safety net in this country, some sort of accountability on the part of government, and frankly, some accountability on the part of rich people. You do need to pay taxes into the broader social good. People do need to actually take things to court if they have an issue rather than just pick up their gun and shoot someone that they don't like, right? And so because of the New Deal, for many, many years, don't romanticize it. The New Deal had, it was discriminatory. The New Deal, the lynching still happened. Racial violence was still a deep and insidious problem in America. But at least culturally, the idea was that the rule of law mattered and that the government had some sort of a responsibility to take care of people. And from that, we get the American middle class, again, overwhelmingly white, but nevertheless, a group of people that benefited from that. The thing is, rich people had always wanted to get rid of that.
That's right.
They had been chipping away at it from the day it happened. This is why we get Taft-Hartley's to stop unionization. It's why they're always trying to chip away at it. And we tend to think of like Nixon or Goldwater or, Agnew as the people that were really dealing the death blow. No, actually, they were actually still part of that New Deal order. I mean, even Nixon still, talking about things like a guaranteed, national income and things like, So what happens? The Reagan years are critical because they come on the heels of the end of the 70s. There's a global financial recession, in no small part because of colonial uprisings across the globe that destabilize capital. Markets are in kind of free fall. Urban crisis is really, the cities are bad. New York City in the 70s was bad. But this is also on the heels of a lot of civil rights upheaval, right, to democratize the New Deal. And the Reagan Republicans, in some sense, were brilliant because they understood that this was an opportunity to really manipulate two crises, right? You've got an economic crisis and you've got a social, I wouldn't call it a crisis, I'd call it an opportunity, but to them, they were going to pitch it as a crisis, which is the civil rights era, right? And they understand that this is the time. This is the time to really undo the New Deal. And so when Reagan starts campaigning on things like, government is broken, look at your city, government doesn't work, the public sector doesn't work, your schools are failing, all of this is falling apart. And guess what? The problem here is that black underclass, the problem is the welfare queen, the problem is the thugs, the criminals. That messaging in combination with, really go back to the mythical days of a great America, familiar,
Right.
Was extremely appealing to particularly white folks who felt destabilized by civil rights gains and also felt economically precarious. But what I didn't understand was how much of a plan this was, how much of a curated plan this was. Reagan's insiders you'll see this in the book, are actually saying to him, you got to keep hammering home this message that the government is a failure. It doesn't work. Liberal programs don't work. And meanwhile, while we are gutting them, that will also become more true. And that's literally what they were doing. But they also understood they needed a conduit for the message to make this palatable. Because the thing is, you can't just get rid of everybody's social services. I mean, even white folks, right? They like public schools and they like to be able to send their kids to college. You can't,
Medicaid.
Medicaid, you can't just get rid of it all. So they needed the messaging part of it. And they were explicit. Who was their guy? Rupert Murdoch. And internal documents, basically like Rupert Murdoch, we need him at the New York Post to essentially translate Reagan's messages because we can't count on the liberal press. And for foreign policy, we need the London Times, right? Because we need to sell Star Wars and we need to sell things like, eventually, the war in Grenada and everything else. So when I say that this was a curated moment that is literally stripping the public sector bare, but selling it as necessary, and that the fallout from it is not because income inequality is growing. It is because of people worse off than you who are manipulating that system. That playbook is going to be embraced and doubled down on by every subsequent administration. This is the depressing part, right? Clinton embraces the Reagan Revolution. Everybody takes, I call it the long Reagan Revolution. Everybody takes it a little farther down the path, with one exception, which we can talk about if we want later, which is the Obama Occupy Black Lives Matter moment, which I think is a really important moment. But the response to that on the part of Capitol was, I'm really simplifying this for the party in the RB, but you get the point, right? A black man as president, pushback on Wall Street. We have worked too damn hard to dismantle all this stuff. And so the time to double down on the misinformation, to lift the veil on the racism, to extend the otherization, not just to the black underclass, but to the hordes of immigrants pouring over the border. If this sounds conspiratorial, because it's just that Machiavellian, on the ground in slow real time, you can see that that's exactly what happened. That curating white resentment and rage was instrumental to recreating the Gilded Age that we live in today. And that what we live today is the new Jim Crow Gilded Age, because the Jim Crow era and the Gilded Age were always flip sides of the same coin. And here we are today. They remain flip sides of the same coin, but it's unstable because even for white folks, you know what? It's a Faustian bargain.
That's right.
Because at the end of the day, you still can't afford gasoline or to put food on your table or for your kids to go to college. So it's very unstable, and it requires constant stoking, constant messaging that it's good for you to be angry and it's good for you to be hateful. And vigilantism is something that you got to sanction, because eventually anger is going to bubble over into action. So you don't have any choice really but to sanction it. And I'm sorry, I just went on way too long. Don't take one of my classes.
I feel like we
History
got
101.
You just gave us 180 years of. This is what I'm talking about. 180 years of history just in like 6 minutes.
Everybody's like, I'm glad I don't attend the University of Michigan.
No, but I first of all, just two things I want to draw out about that. One is that one reason why I think it's important to attend to that is that, some people, there's sometimes people are just like, oh, nothing's changed. It's the same old story. I don't like the same old story version of history. I think it's important to recommend that this power has to constantly be reconstituted over and over again so that we don't invisibilize the work that people have done to fight against it. And that, so that's one thing. The other thing that I think is really important is that the world, you look at, in a way, the way that Bernie Goetz and the Washington Post views the world, the way that Trump is inviting us to see the world, they don't want us to think about context. They don't want us to think about what brought people to that subway before. So in a weird way, even the way you attend to Bernie Goetz is the opposite of how Bernie Goetz wanted us to think about the world. Like, no, these are just villains. It's simple. And it's tempting when you have someone who's done such heinous things and said such heinous things. So that's really important. And actually turning to that, one thing that's fascinating is that in the justification and sort of like making Bernie Goetz into a hero, people really paint these young men, who were on the subway as that they were threatening him, that they were going to rob him, that they lying about the fact that they had sharpened screwdrivers, even though those screwdrivers were zipped up in people's pockets, not near Goetz. So they're painting him as a threat. But interestingly, that's not necessarily how he explains things.
No. His confession, when he finally turns himself in and he confesses, in a 2-hour detailed, excruciatingly detailed confession. He makes clear that as he says, robbery had nothing to do with it. As he says that a previous mugging he had gone through had nothing to do with it. In essence, he didn't like the gleam in Troy Canty's eye. He said it several times. And he said, and if I would have had more bullets, I would have shot them again and again. My goal was to kill them all. That was his...
He's saying this I'm sorry. He's saying this in a deposition.
Yeah. No, he's making it, and it's videotaped. And so, again, this is why this moment was so interesting to me, because I also had to kind of recognize in that today's moment where we are told repeatedly, up is down and down is up. I mean, our eyes are telling us one thing, and it's all being curated to be something completely different. And we think that's new. And in some sense, it is new in the sense that, new in the grand scheme of American history, I suppose. But it really begins in this moment, and it is able to become so normalized, so mainstreamed because of this other history the book tells, which is the rise of the conservative misinformation media that, again, I didn't appreciate. And you're the journalism professor. I didn't appreciate the extent to which Rupert Murdoch's empire, and specifically the New York Post, was going to be so important to the rise of what will become the moment we live in. It will become Fox News. It will become the station that mainstreams misinformation. And it will be the entity that pushes even the mainstream media to shy away from context in favor of more sound bites and, what sells. And it's a fascinating story because Murdoch himself understood the power of this Goetz moment. So when the tape even happens, you think, oh, well, surely when it takes 2 grand juries to even get him to trial, but you think surely this is going to be curtains for him when he goes to trial. And you just, blow by blow, you watch this trial unfold, and you quickly understand that this jury is not going to convict him, no matter how much evidence they have, but not in kind of the old-fashioned Southern, like the trial of Emmett Till's murder, not in that way, not just the guy's white, so that's it, in a much more dangerous, subtle way, that everything that you see in the courtroom is being spun in a different way. It's all it's a house of mirrors. This whole court scene is a house of mirrors. And that's when I understood, again, this power of obfuscation, created rage. And just last thing, I didn't also appreciate Fox News, when he buys the Fox News franchise or creates Fox News, for example, there's a deliberate move made to make sure that they get rights to the NFL franchise. And this is an important strategic moment because they understand, this is the Murdoch folks, understand that most, this is maybe they were wrong, but I think that they were taking a gamble. A lot of working class white guys are not big into watching the nightly news. But what they do want to do is watch sports, and they want to watch a lot of sports. So what we're going to do is brand loyalty. So if you're watching sports on Fox, and then you have a 24-hour news station that you can just flip to find out, okay, yeah, well, what is happening in the world? What is happening in the world? This was, again, how we get a situation where by the time Trump runs the second time, he's on there 200 times.
Wow.
And he is banging away at misinformation but by then they've just said, okay, there's nothing stopping us now. And even a $740 million settlement against them for misinformation is worth the price. Because what's the victory? What does $740 million buy you? It buys you what we have right now. Unfettered capital, no more regulations, the ability to do what Trump just did with Ticketmaster, the ability to let rich people decide everything. And that was worth $740 million judgment against them for misinformation.
One of the reasons that I came to feel that we actually owe it to ourselves and to some of the characters in the book, people in the book, to read it is because you spend time with, for example, the Cabey family, who was, in a way, they were they were all sort of like outrageous acts, but the most heinous in a way feels like Cabey because he was so far away, he's paralyzed for life. How did you approach bringing context about this family and, sort of telling their story?
I'm so grateful that you asked that because it's actually, always feel a little emotional when I talk about this part of the story because a couple of quick things. First of all, I am ashamed and embarrassed to admit that when I came to this story, I remembered Bernie Goetz. It's the reason I came to the story, but I had no idea who the people were that he shot.
Right.
And I'm a pretty informed person. I'm always looking for those kind of details, and I could not have, you could have ransomed my kids, and I wouldn't have been able to tell you the names of the kids that he had shot. So that was kind of my point of departure. And I just said, I am going to tell this story, but this is going to be a really different history of what happened. And I'm going to center, to the best of my ability, the story of the kids that he shot. And so Darrell Cabey sort of became the main one that I talked about. In no small part because his mother just refuses to go away. She's just this incredible figure who just pushes and pushes and pushes. But also because, again, growing up where I grew up in Detroit, I was so struck as a young person by the city of Detroit. I mean, again, this will seem foreign to a lot of people here, but everybody had an idea about what Detroit was, and everybody had an idea about who Detroiters were and what they did and what they looked like and what they were about. And it was so out of sync with everything that I actually knew to be true. And this was, Detroit was a mess, and economically it was falling apart. It was, terrible drug addiction and it was dangerous, like all of those things. But it was also a place where human beings lived. And it was a place where people were trying to eke out, to survive, to make it in one of the most brutal, austere economies that we had since the Great Depression. And I wanted to tell that story. And it was hard because it was hard to find, right? I mean, Bernie Goetz's story was everywhere, and only 2 of his victims are still alive. And one of them, Darrell Cabey, is not only paralyzed, but he's brain damaged because he went into a coma afterwards. And so, he's unavailable to talk to. And the other one, Troy Canty, is the only one that kind of managed to, get a life after all of this. And he is off the grid. I mean, he refuses to talk, and right on to him. Like, he doesn't trust anyone to tell his story. And so then I also made the decision at that point I wasn't going to interview Goetz because I just figured we've heard enough, and I'm going to just go back and do it through piecing together stuff about the family from like the application to the Crime Victims Board.
And I mean, that's a very counterintuitive decision to make that choice. To say, but Goetz has had enough of a platform. But I just say it really works.
Well, I might have talked to him if I could have talked to them, but I sure wasn't going to talk to him if I couldn't also talk to the people he'd shot, because to me that was just going to be a reproducing of.
Well, as we turn toward thinking about hope, and I hope you all are thinking about your questions. I don't know where we're at on time, but I got to say that it was weird to experience emotionally, like everything about the Cabey story and all Canty, James Ridge, all of them was infuriating, and yet with the Cabeys, in particular Shirley Cabey, his mother, it was also a source of hope because you realize that people are persevering. They're living through this, and it just felt like attending to their humanity was itself fighting the narrative that all these people were rendering. But what in this do you feel like gives us? I mean, I don't even know if maybe hope is. I don't know. Hope is never too much to expect, but what do you feel in this story points the way forward for us? I mean, and I just, let me just say, add one piece to that. One thing that this book clarified for me is like so much of when we look at the cruelty that's being unleashed now through policies and war and, you know, budgets and executive orders, there's like this thing that, one thing I think that has pulled out the rug is people just feel like if we could just get the facts in front of people, if we could just tell people, and then you realize, oh no, cruelty is kind of the point here, right? They kind of, you know, like the facts don't matter. There's an assault on facts. This, you see that at work and kind of really germinating in this story. But what do we learn about the way forward and as sort of something to keep us going?
You know, it may seem Pollyannish to say, but I actually think that there's seeds of a lot of hope in this book, or at least I hope that there are. There's, you know, as you say, the personal stories, I think, are hopeful because it does remind us that, you know, no matter how brutal a system is and how hopeless a situation is, the problem with utter domination, even if someone would like to pull it off, is that on the other end of that domination are human beings that have an irrepressible desire to not just survive, but to thrive. And so that's always a hopeful element. I think politically there's a lot of hopeful germs. I mentioned several times now, I think that this entire operation that we are experiencing right now is deeply unstable. And it doesn't feel like it because it feels so comprehensive. It feels so domineering, as you say, facts don't matter anymore. And you know, we don't control the media. But you have to think about it, sort of turn the script around. In order to invest that kind of energy in misinformation, it means that they understand how unstable it is. And there is plenty of moments when they have been shown how unstable it is. So again, I want to go back to that moment. The Reagan Revolution has been percolating along from in the 80s, the 90s, you got the Giuliani 90s, you got the Clinton 90s, you've got Bloomberg's era, like it's all popping along here. And then we get the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And Americans had been kind of, you know, drinking the Kool-Aid and you know, sucking in the ether. And yet suddenly it all just got kind of turned on its head. Obama wins by a landslide. Let's be really clear about that. It wasn't just a eking it out by the tiny margins. He won by a landslide, and his victory was accompanied by a lot of really important things. And I want to shout out Occupy, because Occupy, for the media, I mean, someone's got to do a really important history of Occupy, because if you were to just read American accounts of Occupy, you would think that this was just some bunch of crazy kids that got together at Zuccotti Park. No, it was national. It was quite powerful. It went on for months and months and months, and it was international. And the demand was clear that the top 1% cannot be allowed to dominate everything and do whatever the hell they want. And it was so powerful, in fact, that when the collapse happens, it, you know, Dodd-Frank, like whatever, it's not enough. It's not nationalizing, you know, Wall Street. It's not taking away all their power. But it was the first rebuke of Wall Street that had happened since 1981 with the Tax Reform Act of Reagan. So that happens. Then you got Black Lives Matter moment, which is obviously mostly led by Black folks, but becomes very quickly multiracial, particularly when you get George Floyd's murder, right? So, I mean, things by George Floyd's summer feel very, very possible. Meanwhile, we're beating back mass incarceration, or at least we're trying like hell to do it. We are, you know, criminal justice reform is a huge investment in that, energy in that, you know, ending solitary confinement for juveniles. I mean, this is a moment. And that moment scared the bejesus out of the people who had worked so hard to keep things the way they were. So again, it's unstable. So then we get Trump. All the wheels come off. There's no lies to get back to start ginning up that white resentment. He gets Bernie's possible voters. Right? Because the Democratic Party didn't want Bernie's voters. Why? Because that would have meant taking on Wall Street. Let's be clear.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so where are we now? Well, I think where we are now in New York City is kind of exciting, to be honest with you. I mean, I think that the election of Mamdani is really important, whether you think it's all good or bad. That's not what I mean. What I mean is he won by a landslide. in a city that had put in Giuliani, in a city that had put in Bloomberg, in a city that has the
whole machine.
the worst income inequality of any other city in America. And New Yorkers said, no more. We want things like childcare. We want landlords to be held accountable. We want some accountability of the richest Americans. And then look what the New York State legislature just did today. Basically saying we're going to tax rich folks again. I mean, again, if you want an overhaul of the society more fundamentally, it seems like, oh, well, okay. But that's fundamentally important if you think about this instability of the slow march of what rich folks have been able to do for the last 50 years. So in all of that, I think is hope.
Absolutely. I remember election night, right before election night, I think it was NYC Public Radio, went to both candidates and were like, what do you want to leave voters with? And, Cuomo was like, public safety, right? In other words, an invitation to be scared, right? More policing, the same world that produced Goetz. And then Mamdani was like, universal child care.
And which one won the day is what matters, right? Because at the end of the day, you can anger takes you a long way. We all know that you're in a breakup with someone, or you've had a fight at work. Like it takes you a long way. It can take you a few days. But at the end of the day, you're like, oh, but I don't know my friend anymore. Oh, I don't, like at the end of the day, it doesn't do anything. And I think so many people are waking up to the fact that at the end of the day, I can be as mad at immigrants as I want. I can lock up as many people as I want. But wait a second, hello, huh? I can't even pay my rent anymore. And so not to make this all about economy and materialism, but there are many moments in American history, in fact, where ordinary people have repelled racism, have resisted the temptation to go to the lowest common denominator, and have stood together for the common good. And we've never gone quite as far as some other countries have. Our social welfare state was always weak. I mean, think about it this way. You get Thatcherism in Britain, you get Reaganism in this country. Why were we in so much worse shape than Britain was in that regard? Because our welfare state was weaker to start with.
That's right, yeah.
But that doesn't mean that this is stable. It doesn't mean that this is the end of the universe. And it isn't quite European fascism for that reason, because we have our own relationship with the Gilded Age and the Jim Crow era, and we will keep revisiting it if we don't learn from it.
Well, I can't think of a better way to transition to Q&A than that. Please, just can we give an applause to my... So yeah, we will maybe now take some questions.
Wow, I get to ask the first question. I was really curious, you were talking about this sort of Rupert Murdoch, Reagan conspirational thing, and I'm curious if you were able to suss out what the end goal of that was, and if where we are today looks similar to that, if it was, yeah. So thank you, and thank you both for being here.
Yeah, no, I mean, the end goal was exactly where we are today. The end goal was to free up all restrictions on capital and to basically allow the wealthiest Americans to do what they wanted to do. And the way that you did that was you discredited liberalism and you discredited anything public. So private schools are better than public schools, private healthcare is better than public healthcare. Like the whole message was privatization, because they understood that the only people that were going to really inherit that would be, benefit from that were rich people. So notably, Murdoch is able to create Fox News and dominate the market the way that he was able to, in no small part because of deregulation. Right? Because the FCC had deregulated so dramatically by the time Fox starts in the 90s that basically it's possible to take over media markets, and the same thing happens in newspapers, right, as we know. Right. And that radio, I mean, this is made possible. That was the goal. The goal was control, power. And of course, yes, that's where we are today. It was really brilliant, actually. I mean, I almost feel like you could read this book it's like kind of a how-to manual
Sadly,
for,
yeah, it
you
is.
know, how to take power in 40 years. And yet it's unstable.
Do you want to stand up and speak to the mic?
I have a question. I'm curious about the outcome of the Goetz trial. What is your analysis of what produced the outcome? Did jurors talk about their view of the case? Did the judge shape the trial in a way that produced the outcome? I'm just curious about how you analyze the ultimate outcome.
Oh, that's such a great question. I will share with you that was the thing that kept me up the longest and hardest to really piece out. I think a little bit of all of those things. I have to say, I did actually admire the judge a lot. I came out of it admiring the judge and actually admiring the prosecutor a lot for the judge for really trying to keep a hold of this octopus that was the Goetz trial and try to keep it fair. But there were myriad moments when I think he fell down on that job. But in fairness to him, I mean, Bernie Goetz hires, some of you may remember the name, Barry Slotnick. And that was one of the most brilliant moves that ever could have happened. I mean, if I ever commit a crime, I want Barry Slotnick to represent, or his ilk to represent me, because he was a brilliant storyteller and a crafter of narrative so that you were just bamboozled. Like you didn't, I mean, up was down, down was up in the courtroom. There was a moment when he persuades the judge that they're going to do a reenactment of the trial. And imagine that Chenj and I are the jury here, and they tape off what is in effect a gladiator arena. They bring in 4 guardian angels who are deliberately chosen for the darkness of their skin and their bulk and their height. I mean, mind you, the victims themselves were like 5'6". They were like these kind of puny kids. And they surround the one white guy who plays Bernie Goetz, and they are allowed to enact a series of events that never happened. Like, that were never testified to, nor did Bernie Goetz ever admit to. And the jury sees that, right? Also, the jury was allowed to be, half of which had been a victim of subway crime and 3/4 of which had been mugged. What else? Anything else you remember?
One thing I just also want to mention is a reminder that Curtis Sliwa is an important character in this book, by the way.
That's right.
At this moment, but
he gets money. He goes on the subway drumming up money for the defense fund and the NRA. We failed to mention the NRA,
that's right, yes.
Which also is bankrolling the defense and will take his victory. And from that will come very directly stand your ground laws across the country. So yeah, we forgot to say it. But anyway, So the jury does speak up.
Yeah, and I would, one thing I'll just jump in and say is that this question about how this jury, because we get the events in the structure of the book of what happened relatively early. This question of how does this wind up with this acquittal that, is what drove my curiosity through the book. And the only way to get that is to attend to everything in the book is like, and one thing I will say is, it was a question I was going to ask you, but I fear that I know the answer is, because you've told us what's happening in the background, right? There's one thing happening in the drama, but if you did the same thing in another historical period that had not been subject to Reagan and neoliberalism in the U.S., it's like, does the jury respond the same way? Everybody's in an atmosphere and condition of fear and racism. So I wonder how this might have played out in different things, because it feels like the 80s is part of the answer to the jury.
I think that's right. I think the 80s is part of the answer, but it's also the case that, when I tell you that this is the birth of that moment when you're being told that your eyes are not to be believed and that what you see is not what happened, and that in fact the victims are the villains, the trial doesn't happen until 1987. This happens in 1984. There's been such curation of how to understand this by the time the trial even happens. And, to be really blunt about it, I do take you into the jury room, and it's kind of a horrifying story about how the jury, in effect, particularly one juror, makes up the law. I'll just say it. Like, it just completely takes the jury instructions, which have already been so distorted by the time this comes along. It's just a mess. But then basically says their own theories about what happened and their own theories about what reasonableness is and what self-defense is, and then they acquit him. And they are celebrities in their own right for doing it.
Those half-cocked theories wrong theories are a book which we don't want to advertise, right?
Yeah. I mean, one of the jurors ends up doing a gig with the New York Post after the trial, three edition spread on kind of inside the trial, and that just tells you all you need to know.
Great. Sorry.
Yeah.
So a question I had, and I agree with the point that was made about the prose. It's so beautiful, and it really does help to move the story through some complex, dynamics at play. And I think this book kind of has all these arguments that you make, but makes an argument for secondary sources. Primary sources are so important, and this book is taking us up into a period where we can go on YouTube and see the clips, and we can see the primary sources ourselves. But it's such an important moment to have someone distill all the information down into an argument. And we're in kind of a golden age of books about the late 70s and 80s right now, Ben Chainsfield and Sean Harris's book. I'm just wondering, as you were writing, what secondary sources you wish existed to kind of help tell the story, or to have to the right and left of this story to be able to paint a picture of some of the dynamics of the time period.
Well, the good news is, because I didn't take 13 years to write this book, this is all much more fresh. So I was actually able to benefit enormously from amazing books like LaShawn Harris's book, Tell Her Story, on the South Bronx and the murder of Eleanor Bumpers, Ben Chansfield's book, Born in Flames, about the Bronx. There was a lot of really rich stuff, Gods of New York. There was a lot of rich stuff already being written or just published, or I got to see the manuscript of it. Leon Nafaka had just done an amazing podcast on the Bernie Goetz case, and thanks to Leon, I was able to see the transcripts of those podcasts, to look at some of the interviews that they'd been able to do. So I am so grateful. Kim Phillips-Fine's stuff on the fiscal crisis in New York, I leaned heavily into my fellow scholars' work. And that freed me to then be able to really get into the nitty-gritty of the legal stuff and the primary stuff. I will say, though, there's great new stuff coming that I can't wait to see, and some of it is going to be fiction. Colson Whitehead is coming out with a new book on the 1980s. Viet Nguyen's coming out with a new book on the 80s. This is going to be novels, fiction, and I'm super excited because I think this is the decade that we really need to reckon with anew.
Sure. Thank you. Great. I think I understand you're saying that we're essentially still in the Reagan era.
Yep.
And that the one exit ramp that we had was during the Obama years. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, alternative history, if at that Obama moment when he came in during the fiscal crisis, if we'd seen a half dozen bankers, hauled off in shackles, where might we be now?
Yes. I mean, that could have been history changing. And this is where we have the sobering, kind of traumatic realization of the real pickle we're in right now, right? Which is that we can't possibly, I won't presume for everyone standing in this room, but I'll speak for myself. I can't possibly vote Republican in the next elections. But it is deeply troubling that at every moment when there has been a clear message that we cannot keep capitulating to capital, the Democratic Party just keeps capitulating to capital because the head of the party, the legions of most powerful people in the party are those people. And so down ballot is the only way to go. The Stacey Abrams, and that's the electoral answer. But the real answer is what you just said. Until these people are held, until the rule of law matters for everybody, from the wealthy to white folks in general, until the rule of law matters in some meaningful way, until there's a more comprehensive overhaul of capital, we're going to be doing this dance for a long time to come. I just pray that it's not going to be this dance, because this dance is pretty horrific and dangerous for humanity, right? Not just for our democracy.
We have time for just one more question. And
Well, hi, and again, thank you for coming out. As a historian, I know when you do a super deep dive, especially to a book this thick, right? Was there like a particular primary source that like was so shocking to you, or that stood out, that just unfortunately couldn't make the book?
No, and that's why my book is so long. I tend, if I see it, you're going to have to see it. That's kind of the way I write. But I will just shout out, there was a source that just blew my mind, and that was the probation report that was written in advance of Bernie Goetz's sentencing. And that document was fascinating because in it, it was so thick and deep. It had biographical information I would have known otherwise. I mean, there's all kinds of, like the historian is like, aha, this is the document. It's going to tell me everything. But what was so shocking about that document was, again, just watching this just acrobatics. Like they would say, well, it is true that at the community board tenants meeting in his apartment prior to the shooting, he was using the N word and the S word, and it's true that he, has used racial epithet, and it's true that he's pulled guns on people before when he came across, upon whatever black youth walking near him in Central Park. This is all true, but his best friends say that he's not a racist, and then there'll be all these quotes from his best friends. And after all, you need to remember that the people that he shot were criminals, and that they had over 13 warrants out for their arrest. And you're just watching in real time. And I have to say, I mean, it was just kind of shocking. It was just kind of shocking to watch the lengths people would go to circle a square. But it made it in the book, sorry. That's it, huh?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great questions. Thank you, Heather. Oh my God. Thank you so much.